Well, I'm really, really pleased to be speaking to a photographer who's based in India, in Calcutta, and it's Sroyon Mukherjee. And it's a very, very warm welcome to you, Sroyon, for taking the time to have a chat with me on the Photopocene podcast. Warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Josie. Thanks for having me.
No problem.
For our chat.
No problem at all. And I'm always so relieved when the technology enables us to have a chat over such big distances, because I'm based here in the UK in Cornwall. So it's really lovely to be able to speak to you. Now, I'm very excited actually to have a chat with you, because one of the ways that you work with photography is something that I've always had a love for. I haven't done an awful lot of it myself. So I'm really looking forward to finding out a little bit more from yourself. And that's really around your passion for making pinhole cameras, and actually making pinhole cameras that are entirely made, perhaps bar some tape, I think, from household waste items, which is a perfect eco-conscious way of creating photographic art. What can you tell me about your sort of process of making these pinhole cameras then?
So I got into pinhole photography this summer because of the lockdowns, and because of my probably my favorite form of photography is just going out on the street, taking walks, chatting to people. And this is lens photography, as pinhole photographers call it. So photography using cameras with lenses. But that was obviously less of an option. And I'm not so much into still life and the other kinds of photography that you can do at home. So I started exploring alternative processes, like lumen printing and anthotypes and things like that. So other forms of printing. And that gradually led me to pinhole photography. And I think I like DIY type projects in general, but I don't have a whole lot of DIY skills. So I can't do woodworking, for example, or I can't do 3D printing. And some people make beautiful cameras out of woodworking, and they make ingenious designs from 3D printers. But I don't really have the skills for that. So I gravitated more towards making cameras from things I already have at home, and that obviously has the benefit of being environmentally friendly, because it's a form of recycling or upcycling, if you will. Yeah, so that was kind of my road into it.
Absolutely, and it's a lovely, like you say, a lovely way to reuse products that might normally just get thrown away. So it's rather than creating a new disposable camera, I don't know if you remember sort of back, I think probably maybe the 80s, 90s, when disposable cameras were quite popular at weddings and etc. But it's almost like you're making from something disposable, you're making the camera. And I really love that. That's what you're doing. And you have actually sent a photograph to me of some of, I believe, is it the cameras you've made? So you have one with a dry fruit cake tin.
Yeah, that's right.
You've got some there with camera canisters, which I guess is another way of reusing a plastic item, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean that's not the best one. It's quite small. So I made it as kind of a fun thing. It's like a meta project, isn't it? Because it's like made from a thing which film comes in. So there's kind of a fun aspect to that. But as a camera, it's not so great, because the size of the sensor, so to speak, is quite small. Like it has to fit into that canister, obviously. But it's a fun project. And like pinhole photography is not about getting the sharpest picture or the best quality anyway.
I mean, pinhole does have a wonderful ethereal quality, I think, to the results. If someone wasn't actually sure what we were talking about when we say a pinhole camera, could you just describe what you actually do when you create one of your cameras?
Yeah, sure. So a camera, like any camera, not just pinhole, is essentially a dark box with a sensor behind it, right? And that sensor can be a digital sensor, that can be film, it can be photographic paper, which I often use. So that's paper made for enlarging. So it's coated with a light sensitive emulsion, and it's generally made to print photos on, but since it's light sensitive, it can also be used for photography. But yeah, so essentially it's a box with light coming in through one end, and forming an image on the other end, right? And that other end has something to record that image. So that's essentially what a camera is. And a pinhole camera is similar. And you could say that pretty much anything else that's on a camera is like frills for convenience or improving the image quality and all of that. Right? And a pinhole camera is essentially the same thing, except that you don't have a lens. And instead of a lens, what you have is a tiny hole, and light rays enter through that hole. So if you imagine a tree, a light ray from the top of that tree would enter the pinhole, and would form a corresponding point at the bottom of the sensor. And another light ray from the bottom of the tree would enter through the light hole, and form an image point at the top of the sensor. So in this way, you have like multiple points on the tree being imaged at multiple points on the sensor, and you have an inverted image formed on the sensor. So yeah, that's essentially how it works. But because there's no lens, it's a very primitive design, the quality of the image isn't as sharp as what you have in most lens cameras.
Yeah, it has. It does have sort of that sort of almost ghostly effect. I would a nice softer feel to an image. So I guess yes, if you're after perfectly sharp in focused images, it might not be for you. But and also I guess exposure times as well. So you with your pinholes, have you? I think you've sent an image of a beer can that you used once as well, and that was to create a solar graph. So that's when you leave the exposure open for quite some time. What did you get results wise with that then?
So I've seen solar. I've only just started on solar cans. I've mostly been doing regular photography. Solar can, again, for those who don't know, is essentially a pinhole camera, but it's pointed in a way that it captures the path of the sun, and over multiple days. So it's typically for weeks, months, even years. I think recently someone discovered a camera in the UK. I think it was that someone had mounted on an observatory and forgotten about it. Yes. And they discovered it after 8 years. So there was like 8 years worth of sun trails on the sensor. So that's like an extreme long exposure. I've only done one so far. It wasn't very good, but it was a week long experiment. I hadn't really oriented it in a way that it captured much of the sun's light, so I just sort of guesstimated it rather than doing more precise calculations. And I just put it up on a tree, and then I realized it was facing in a direction where it was only capturing like a short part of the sun's path. But it works in, like, I could see that it works in theory. So if I orient it the right way, I should be able to get an image. And yeah, I've seen like images made by exposures which are years long even. So that's pretty cool.
They can be incredibly beautiful, can't they, with the trails that the sun makes. So yeah, I shall look forward to seeing what you come up with the more you sort of practice with it, and where you place the camera. When you're actually out and about then on the streets, I mean, often nowadays with smartphones, people perhaps might be less perturbed by someone walking around with a camera. But what do you find when you're using your pinholes then? Does it spark conversations?
Yeah, it definitely does. And I like taking photos of people, as I mentioned earlier, even with lens cameras. And pinhole isn't really so people aren't typically the subject of pinhole photos because the exposure times are so long. And the pinhole is obviously tiny. So we are looking at, So if you're accustomed to using lens cameras, then the smallest aperture on your lens is probably f16 or f22. On the pinhole camera that I use most, the aperture is about f175, so it's really, really small. And that obviously means like longer exposure times. So you have a lot of motion blur if things are moving around and so forth. But I still do like taking photos of people. So what I'll do is I'll go out in bright sunlight and explain to people what it is I'm trying to do. And yeah, that really leads to some fun conversations. There's a fish market near where I live, and one of the fishmongers, I took a photo of him, and he said, "Can you give me an extra copy, please? I want to show it to my wife." And I said, "Well, if you're going to show it to your wife, then I'll get a proper camera and take a nice photo," because he'd seen other photos from my camera before, because I've taken photos in this area a lot, not of him but of others. So he knew what the image quality was like. So I said, you've seen that the images are, they're black and white and they're kind of blurry. But he was like, no, I want a photo from this camera, not a regular photo. So you can see there's like a certain fascination with the instrument and the process and all of that.
Oh, that's really lovely.
Many questions as well. I was recently speaking to someone else who scared a stranger, I think, because it's depending on sort of how wary you are, or like where in the world or where in a particular city you are. I think people can be a bit suspicious about people fiddling with sort of homemade looking squarish devices. Yeah, so there's like different experiences, but yeah, it's all fun so far.
Excellent. And you saying that it's all fun, I have to say that I've actually on your Instagram account, I was actually really intrigued by your photograph of a horse with a pinhole camera. So I think that was probably a fun experience for you too, and you actually got caught on camera by your friend trying to take an image of a horse on a pinhole camera.
Yeah, that didn't work very well, as you saw. It's just like a blur. I was just the horse had been kind of standing still. I calculated I'd need about a 1 minute exposure, and before that he was kind of standing still, grazing. So I thought I'd take a chance, but then he started sort of moving around. Maybe he got spooked by me placing the camera quite close to him. It's a very wide angle camera, so I had to go really close. If you saw the other photo which my friend took, I'm like placing it quite close to where he's grazing.
But 10 out of 10 for attempt. So yeah. And I think as well, Sroyon, what you've also said to me is that with your photography, obviously the way that you reuse materials is part of sort of your sustainability and eco-conscious thinking around photography, but you're also you also consider sort of water usage and sort of because that's something that in photography normally when you have to wash films or paper prints, that you can actually, water can just be on constantly, and people will leave a tap running for hours in. So what do you do then to try and minimize that sort of around the water usage?
Yeah, so I grew up in India, and I lived till I was about 16, 17 years old. We always lived in rented houses, and we often had problems with water in general. So like sort of water conservation, not even necessarily for environmental reasons to begin with, but just as a sort of day-to-day practical matter, is kind of hardwired into my thinking, because we often had landlords who would only switch on the pump. So we had an electric pump, and they would only maybe switch it on once a day, and you had to make sure that you didn't use up your day's quota of water. So that's something we think about all the time anyway. Yeah. Now we have our own flat, but obviously it's still a good idea to use as little water as possible. The other thing is we have a septic tank at home. And I know that in the UK, I lived in the UK for the last 10, 11 years or so. And if you look at Ilford's guidance, they say that you can dispose of, if you're only developing in small quantities, you can sort of dispose of certain chemicals down the sink. Although that's ideally you would take it to a recycling center regardless, but their, at least what their information says, and I don't know anything more to contradict that, is that household quantities of developing are typically not a problem, but it is if you live on a septic tank where it's not sort of a large scale industrial strength effluent treatment mechanism, right? So that's another thing that's always at the back of my mind, of disposal. So even sort of relatively small quantities of benign chemicals, I don't put them in the septic tank, because they can sort of mess with the bacteria that are essential to the functioning of the septic tank itself. And yeah, in general, I'll try and sort of, if I'm washing just chemicals, if I'm washing film and I know that it only has trace amounts of water in it, rather than pour it down the sink, I'll pour it in a bucket, and then I can use it for cleaning or flushing the toilet and things like that. So that's kind of a way to save it. I've also been using the Ilford method of washing, which I think is sort of less water intensive, where you so this is for film, where you just agitate 5 times and then 10 times and then 20 times. So you're refilling the tank 3 times, as opposed to sort of having a constant flow of water running through it. So yeah, that's different ways I'm trying to minimize consumption. And there's obviously like a limit there's an argument to be made that sort of any photography, or pretty much any non-essential pursuit for that matter, will have a carbon footprint and will have some environmental impact. But I think like it's not really realistic to say you should stop everything and only kind of back to the trees kind of philosophy. But I think it's more about sort of having a relatively fulfilling life, but at the same time trying to minimize our impact and trying to use resources in a sustainable way.
Absolutely, and like you say, it's part of this sort of podcast is having these conversations, and just if someone hasn't thought about it before, if it just makes someone think about perhaps the ways they're using, say for instance, water, what could they do differently that might reuse that water. I mean, we sort of encouraging people here in the UK, they might not think very often that there's potential for drought, but actually there can be times when there's low water levels, not compared maybe to other places, but so people would be encouraged not to water the garden, so to have a rain butt in the garden, all of these sorts of things. So there's lots of, I guess, different ways that you can whatever your hobby is, having a sort of a consciousness about sort of environmental impacts, but at the same time, very much like you said, there's a balance and a compromise, because we still want to be creative, we still want to do the things that we love and that make life interesting, and all of those things. So it's just really lovely to hear that people are thinking about these things in relation to photography. And I think one of the things that also intrigued me is, because I share your love as well for this, is a love of vintage cameras. But I believe that if you ever get the urge to go and buy a vintage camera, you would sometimes think about making a pinhole camera instead. Is that right? Or
yeah. Well, I've kind of, I think right now I'm at a point where I feel like I don't need any more vintage cameras, which maybe like seems like an alien concept to some people I know in through Facebook groups and so forth. But I've got about 6, and I find I actually don't use one of them, which is a really nice camera, Rolly 35, but I don't use it much. So I'm thinking of selling that also, because it just seems like it's a shame to keep such a nice camera just for the pleasure of looking at it, and occasionally like taking it out like once in 2 years or something. But yeah, I mean, but I think like about around last year, there were a couple of times when I remember sort of being when I got into pinhole photography, there were times when I was more focused on pinhole photography, and that kept me from thinking about what's the next camera I want or what's the next lens I want, because or well, if it's more like if it's a pinhole camera I want, I can just make it at home. Whereas if it's a vintage camera, then I'd be searching on eBay or something. So pinhole cameras were keeping me occupied in that sense. And maybe you're familiar with this too, but there's often a tendency for those of us that are into vintage cameras, we are sort of taking a break in the middle of work, just go onto eBay and look through different listings of cameras we're interested in. So this is kind of a nice distraction from that, and I feel like I can make as many as I like without the, maybe guilt is too strong a word, but you know what I mean,
Yes.
without the guilt of owning more cameras than I use or than I need. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It can actually get quite addictive, I think, to sometimes, yeah, when vintage cameras are beautiful objects, but yes, you probably, dare I say it, you could probably have one too many. I'll probably get in trouble for saying that, but yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I definitely have one too many. Yeah.
Now, you actually also write for some photography websites as well, which I'd love to have a little chat more about with you. And it's 35 mmc, and you also, the casual photo file. Are those correct?
Yeah, that's right. I write for both of those. Yeah.
So how did you? Because my last podcast was with Holly, who also writes for 35 mmc. So how did you get involved with the website, and what sort of things do you actually like to write about in particular, if anything in particular?
So I'll answer your second question first. It's really varied. I've written about pinhole photography. I've got a whole series called My Pinhole Adventures. So I started out, I think, calling it My Pinhole Journey, but then Adventures felt like a more accurate description because it felt very exciting and new. So I changed it. I've got, I think, like 5 or 6 parts in that. So it's just like when I discover something. So there's like one part which is about making cameras. One is about the optimal pinhole size. One is an interview of a few pinhole photographers, which I did recently for World Pinhole Day. So there's a World Pinhole Day for those who are not aware, and that was the last Sunday of April. So I did an interview of some other photographers for that. So yeah, some of it is pinhole related. Then I do like camera reviews, alternative processes, darkroom. Yeah, just it's more analog focused, but yeah, it's just a variety of topics. I do more gear reviews or camera reviews, lens reviews, even a couple of book reviews for casual photophile. And for 35 mmc, it's more of the exploratory stuff, or it's not exactly tutorials. It's more about like what things that I'm finding, and then people can kind of follow along with the journey, and maybe they can find something that's of benefit to them, that sort of thing. And about how I got involved, I wrote one article a really long time ago for 35 mmc in 2018 or something. And that's when I've been taking film photographs for a while, but I sort of got more interested in other cameras. So I just had like one film camera, and I was just only using that for many years and not really interested in the gear side of it. And then I bought one or two other cameras, and I thought I'd write a review of like a short review article, like a mini review. And then I didn't write anything again for like 2 years or so. And then during the lockdowns, I started writing the Darkroom series. And then Hamish, who runs 35 mmc, asked me if I'd like to have like a bit of semi-formal role on the website team. And my formal role is actually, I still write, but my main role is actually finding contributors for 35 mmc. So like people with quite diverse interests, because traditionally it's been quite gear focused, but Hamish knows that I'm interested in these alternative techniques and sort of more artistic creative work. Not that there's anything wrong with gear. Like I write gear reviews myself and I read them
Yes.
a lot. But there's just to bring sort of more variety and wider appeal for different kinds of audiences, perhaps. And I actually introduced Holly to Image. So I think I found Holly's Instagram or something, and I liked what I saw. So I asked her if she'd
Brilliant.
like to contribute an article, and then she contributed one, and then she contributed another, and then she was gradually drafted into the team.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's fantastic. And this might be quite a not a difficult question, but so given that we've spoken quite a lot about your sort of love for pinhole cameras, and your last article was around World Pinhole Photography Day, but you've also got this interest in other analog processes or traditional historic alternative processes. Would you be able to choose a favorite, do you think, or is it very much that they all have their individual styles that draw you to them?
Yeah, I mean it's a tough one, as you say. I'd probably I'd definitely say that they all have appealed to me in different ways and to maybe even different aspects of my personality and interests. If I had to pick just one type of photography, I'd maybe it's an unexpected answer, but I'd probably stick with digital. Unexpected and also a boring answer, but yeah, I'd probably stick with that because it's incredibly versatile. And this, but I was actually listening to a well, I didn't listen. So this was a Spanish interview of two pinhole photographers, and my friend who's Spanish listened to the interview and translated bits of it for me. I'm learning Spanish, but I'm definitely not at the level where I can follow a podcast.
Yes.
And one of the things they said, which I really liked, is that we are so lucky at this point in history to have access to 150 years worth of photographic history and processes, and be able to pick any of them and or all of them, time permitting, and just do whatever suits our creative needs. Because I can think of a world maybe like 200 years later when certain forms of photography just can't be practiced because you don't have the materials, or you would have to go to like insane lengths to get I don't know, the chemicals for platinum printing, for example, right? But
Yes.
at this point, I think we have access to pretty much all the photographic processes that have been devised throughout history, and at the same time, we have access to sort of the cutting edge digital stuff as well. So I think we're incredibly lucky in that sense, and I'm lucky to be interested in of these different forms of photography, because as I was saying, and as you suggested, they all kind of bring something else to the table.
Yes, yeah. I think I'm a little bit like you. I mean, if I was pushed and someone said to me, which process would you not want to live without? I mean, I think it would be very difficult to choose. At the moment, I'd probably well, no, I don't know if I could choose, because I sort of tend to mix unfixed lumens, but then scan those images in and apply digital manipulation techniques to them. So
I
yeah,
think you'd be allowed to do that. That's okay. I think yeah, just yeah. So scanning is okay, let's say, but not digital photography itself. So I'll allow you that.
Thank you. Now, I'm also, one of the things that I wonder if it does have an impact on your photography, or has it had an impact on your photography and your interest in photography, is that you've I think it's relatively recently you gained your PhD in environmental law. Now, it's almost like the question, chicken or egg, what came first? So did photography, a love of photography, come first, or environmental issues, or how does that PhD relate to your photography or your interest in environmental matters then?
Yeah, I was interested. I'd probably say interest in the environment more broadly probably came first, because I liked animals. Even when I was a little kid, I liked animals and being in nature and plants and things like that. And I used to work in a law firm. So I graduated in 2009, and then I moved to London to work in a law firm. And I worked there for a couple of years, but then I realized I was sort of more interested in research and B in something sort of directly connected to the environment, and that's why I decided to switch careers in a way. So I quit my law firm job, and I did a master's at LSE and then a PhD subsequently. So yeah, I've also been interested in photography for a long time, but I think I didn't connect the two. But obviously, like when I got into photography as a teenager in like the early 2000s, late 90s maybe, I maybe didn't have the degree of environmental consciousness that teenagers do even now. Like it's not a huge gap in time, but I think the amount of sort of environmental and social awareness that teenagers have is a lot higher. Like I teach undergraduate students now, and I definitely wasn't this socially aware when I was an undergraduate myself, 20 years ago. So yeah, that's definitely something that's changed. So I didn't necessarily connect the two, but then obviously like slowly you start to realize about your personal carbon footprint and e-waste and all of those things and the effect of consumerism. So I think I've been interested in photography and the environment sort of independently, but at some point, obviously, the interests converge, and you start thinking about how one relates to the other. I got really into beekeeping when I was doing my PhD. So we have urban beehives on the roof of one of the LSE buildings, and I became
fantastic.
president of the LSE Beekeeping Society.
Brilliant.
So my 15 minutes of fame. And that's again like something that's connected to the environment. So I find that one way or the other, a lot of my interests somehow seem to be tied into my interest in the environment more broadly.
Yeah, definitely. And I love the fact that you're interested in beekeeping. My husband is hopefully going to be keeping some bees at our allotment, but I'll let you know if that ever happens.
That's exciting. But, yes, please do.
Definitely. It's lovely to hear that you do that too. Now, one question I like to ask everyone before we sort of we finish, and there's no right or wrong answer, but it really is around in relation to photography. Obviously, like you mentioned yourself, the sort of hundreds of years that since photography was invented and has been in use, and we perhaps take it for granted in everyday life. It really does have a huge influence on us, whether we perhaps are aware of it or not. But what do you think photography can actually do to possibly improve environmental issues? How do you think it can make a difference? What do you think photography does to support sustainable living?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think we've talked a lot about the technical stuff behind pinholes and photography more generally, but I mean, ultimately, I think one of the key ways in which photography adds, or photographers for that matter, can add value to society is just by bearing witness, so to speak. And I think images have such power, don't they? So like the image of the pale blue, the famous pale blue dot photograph, for example, of Earth from space, the way that the sort of impact that can have on the human psyche. Or I remember as a kid, I was like barely one of my first memories, probably, I don't know, I was like maybe 5 or 6 years old in the early 90s, when there was the Gulf oil spill, and I remember seeing photographs of like I don't remember which specific oil spill it was, but there was one in the Arabian Gulf, and I remember seeing photographs of cormorants floundering in oil, and
yeah.
those have like such power, even though like at the time they may be disturbing. So I think that's really sort of the content or the substantive part of photography more so than the processes we're talking about. Obviously, like we do have a duty as photographers or even as citizens of the world to minimize our environmental impact. But I think one way that photography can really make a change is by drawing attention to these issues, environmental issues, human rights, inequality, poverty, a lot of things. And yeah, I mean, that's I've like not really done as much of that as I would like. I've gone to some environmental protests and I've taken photos there, but that's like not really a big thing. But that's definitely something I'd like to think about, and I'm thinking about applying for an artist's grant here in India, and I obviously don't know what's going to happen because it's a very competitive grant and all of that. But the thing I want to work on is water shortages in that specific part of the country. So that way I'm trying to take the environmental consciousness part of it and reflect it not just in the way I practice photography, but also in like what I photograph and what I do with the photographs.
Yeah, I'd really like to, if that happens for you, do let me know, and it'd be lovely to be able to share sort of any sort of images of that for you, or talk about that in the future. If people are listening in and they do actually want to find out more about you, and where they could perhaps either see some of your work or find out, sort of the articles that you've written, where are the best places that people can go to find you?
So I write for this website, 35mmc.com, and which is a UK-based website, and for another website called Casual Photophile, which is a US-based website. So if you, there are really good websites in general, so I'd recommend checking them out, regardless of whether you want to see my work or not. There's like work by better photographers and better writers out there in general. But if you want to see my work specifically, they have like author pages, or you can just do a search on the website for my name, my first name, Sroyon, Sroyon, and you'll see my articles. I also have an Instagram. It's called Midtone Gray. So the English way to spell gray. And usually at the top, I have links to my latest articles, so you can also find my articles there. I don't update my Instagram as often as I probably should, but since I've been on Photopocene just now and we've talked about pinhole photography, I'll try and upload some pinhole images in the next few days, and then hopefully by the time the podcast goes live, there'll be a few more for you to see.
Oh, that's fantastic. It'll be lovely. I shall put all of the links for you into the podcast text as well, so people will be able to click through and find you easily. Definitely keep an eye out on your Instagram as well. But I just want to say a really huge thank you, Sroyon, for taking the time out to chat with me. And yeah, I've really sort of loved sort of finding out a little bit more, and I'm hoping in a way it might actually inspire some people to look at the pinhole photography element. I mean, like you say, there's a World Pinhole Photography Day. There's obviously a lot of people out there who were really keen on pinhole photography, and seeing what you've done, it's really fascinating, and there is so much you can get out of it, I think. So thank you once again. I've really had a lovely time chatting with you, and I hope you've enjoyed it as well.
Thank you so much, Josie. Yes, I really enjoyed it. Yeah, thanks. I'm relatively new to pinhole myself, but it's really nice to talk about my interests and hopefully get other people interested as well. So yeah, I do hope some people who are new to pinhole look it up, and maybe some of you will give it a try as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sroyon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josie. Thanks for having me.